The Portland courthouse was a fortress of gray stone and darker memories. Emma hadn't spoken in 6 months. Not a single word. Not to doctors, therapists, social workers, or her desperate mother who held her every night, praying for even a whisper. The 3-year-old sat in the hard wooden gallery bench, her small frame swallowed by the oversized seat, her tiny feet dangling above the floor, eyes hollow and distant like someone who'd seen the end of the world before learning the alphabet. 6 months ago, Emma's mother, Catherine, had simply vanished. One moment she was walking home from work in the Portland drizzle, the next, nothing. Police found her car abandoned on the side of Highway 101, keys still in the ignition, a child's shoe on the passenger seat. The city erupted into panic. Missing posters plastered every telephone pole. Search parties combed the forests. News helicopters circled overhead. Catherine's face appeared on every television screen, a beautiful woman with dark eyes and a desperate smile frozen in her last family photo. Detectives worked 24-hour shifts. The FBI got involved. Days turned into weeks with no leads, no ransom demands, no bodies, just an expanding void of uncertainty that gnawed at everyone involved. Then came the worst part. 2 weeks later, when police finally tracked Catherine down to a basement apartment in a rundown neighborhood 30 miles away, they discovered she hadn't been alone. Emma had been there too. The 3-year-old had been locked in that basement dungeon alongside her mother, witnessing horrors that no child should ever have to comprehend. The man who'd taken them, David Mercer, Catherine's abusive ex-boyfriend whom she'd left 3 years earlier, had systematically tortured Catherine for 14 days while Emma watched from a corner, unable to help, unable to escape, unable to do anything but survive. When police officers broke down that basement door, they found Catherine chained to a radiator, her body covered in bruises that told stories of unimaginable cruelty. Emma was huddled in the corner, catatonic, her eyes wide and unseeing, her small body trembling uncontrollably. The officers had to carry both of them out. Catherine was rushed to the hospital, and Emma was taken to emergency pediatric care, where doctors discovered she was physically unharmed but psychologically devastated. The trauma had locked her away inside herself, a defensive mechanism so complete that she'd simply stopped engaging with the world. Now, 6 months later, Emma sat in the courtroom wearing a pink dress that her mother had carefully selected that morning, hoping somehow color and softness might reach the daughter who disappeared into silence. Catherine sat several rows ahead, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't taken her eyes off Emma since they'd entered the courtroom. Every few seconds, her shoulders would shake slightly as she fought back tears, but she remained silent, respecting the judge's strict orders that family members could not interact with Emma before or during testimony. The trial was collapsing. That was the harsh reality everyone in that courtroom understood, but few spoke aloud. David Mercer sat at the defendant's table, his cheap suit perfectly pressed, his hair meticulously combed, his expression radiating confidence bordering on arrogance. His expensive defense attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Hammond who'd made a career defending the indefensible, had systematically dismantled every piece of evidence the prosecution had presented. The fibers found on Catherine's clothing could have come from anywhere. The phone records placing Mercer's cell near the crime scene, circumstantial. The testimony from neighbors who'd heard screaming from the basement apartment, vague, unreliable, open to interpretation. What the prosecution needed, what they desperately, urgently needed, was Emma's testimony. Only Emma could place Mercer at the location. Only Emma could describe the interior of that basement in details that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Only Emma could identify his voice, his face, his actions. But Emma had locked that knowledge away behind walls of trauma so complete that even the most experienced child psychologists in Oregon had failed to reach her. District Attorney James Morrison had assigned 3 separate child psychologists to work with Emma. Dr. Rachel Peters, who'd spent 15 years working with traumatized children, had tried every technique in her arsenal: play therapy, art therapy, Santre therapy, narrative therapy. Nothing worked. Emma would sit silently, her eyes focused on some distant point no one else could see, completely unresponsive to questions, suggestions, or gentle prompts. Dr. Marcus Wellington had attempted cognitive behavioral approaches, trying to help Emma process her trauma in manageable pieces. That too had failed. Dr. Lisa Huang, a specialist in selective mutism, had worked with Emma for 6 weeks, employing desensitization techniques and graduated exposure therapy. Still nothing. The silence stretched deeper with each passing day. Emma's muteness had become absolute. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She didn't communicate through gestures or drawings or pointing. She simply existed in a state of profound disconnection from the world around her. Her mother reported that Emma had nightmares almost every night, thrashing in her sleep, sometimes crying out in languages of pure pain that weren't quite words. During the day, Emma moved through the world like a ghost, eating only when food was placed directly in front of her, using the bathroom only when her mother took her, playing with toys without any apparent enjoyment or engagement. Now the trial was reaching its critical juncture. The defense was preparing to argue that without concrete testimony from an eyewitness who could clearly identify Mercer, the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence insufficient for conviction. Mercer's attorney had already filed motions suggesting that the state didn't have enough to proceed. The judge had overruled those motions, for now, but everyone understood the stakes. If Emma didn't testify, if she remained locked in her silence, David Mercer would likely walk free. He would return to the world, unpunished, unfettered, potentially free to hunt again. The prosecutor looked across the courtroom and made eye contact with Emma. The little girl stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench so tightly her fingers had gone pale. Morrison felt desperation clawing at his chest. He'd built his career on winning, on justice, on making sure that predators faced consequences. But how do you prosecute a crime when the only eyewitness is a traumatized 3-year-old whose mind had constructed an impenetrable fortress to protect itself? That's when everything changed. That's when someone, Detective Sarah Chen, a veteran officer who'd worked cases involving animals for 15 years, walked into his office with an idea so unconventional, so outside the realm of traditional courtroom procedure, so desperate and yet so scientifically grounded that it offered the slimmest possibility of hope. An idea involving a dog. An idea that would alter the trajectory of this entire case and prove that sometimes the most powerful tools for justice aren't found in law books or interrogation techniques, but in the quiet, unconditional presence of an animal who understood something about trauma that no human could fully grasp. Detective Sarah Chen burst through the prosecutor's office door without knocking, her face flushed with urgency and something that looked dangerously close to hope. District Attorney James Morrison looked up from the case file spread across his mahogany desk, annoyed at the interruption. He'd been staring at the same documents for 3 hours, searching for some detail, some overlooked piece of evidence that could salvage this case. Chen didn't wait for permission to speak. She pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat down, her eyes blazing with an intensity that immediately commanded his attention. "We bring in Duke," she announced breathlessly, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. "We bring the dog into the courtroom." Morrison stared at her in silence for a long moment, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion to something approaching concern for her mental health. "A dog," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made any sense. "In my courtroom. Detective, I appreciate your dedication to this case, but we're not running a petting zoo here. We're prosecuting a violent crime. The judge will laugh us out of the building." Chen leaned forward, her hands pressed flat on his desk, speaking with rapid-fire intensity. She'd spent the last week researching, reading scientific studies, contacting universities and trauma specialists. What she was about to tell him wasn't just theory. It was grounded in neuroscience, in psychology, in documented cases from across the country where conventional approaches had failed but animal-assisted interventions had worked miracles. "Listen to me," Chen said, her voice dropping to a more measured tone. "Emma's selective mutism isn't neurological. It's not a physical inability to speak. It's psychological armor. Her brain has literally shut down her ability to communicate as a survival mechanism. The trauma was so severe that her mind constructed walls so thick, so impenetrable that no amount of traditional therapy is breaking through. We've tried 3 separate psychologists. We've tried every evidence-based technique in the book. Nothing works because we're working against her brain's most fundamental protection instinct." Morrison leaned back in his chair, listening now despite his skepticism. Chen continued, pulling out printed research papers and case studies from her jacket pocket. She spread them across his desk like a prosecutor laying out crime scene evidence. "But here's what's fascinating," Chen said, tapping one of the studies. "There's this concept called non-threatening presence. When a child is in a state of severe trauma, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, is in overdrive. They're perceiving threats everywhere and everything and everyone. Therapists, doctors, lawyers, they're all authority figures. They're all associated with the trauma somehow. But an animal can't hurt them with words. An animal can't ask them invasive questions. An animal communicates pure, unconditional acceptance without judgment." She pulled out another document, this one featuring a case from California. A 6-year-old boy who'd been sexually abused and hadn't spoken to anyone in 8 months. Every therapeutic intervention had failed. Then, during a routine visit, a therapy dog had entered the room. Within 2 hours of being in the dog's presence, the boy had begun speaking. Within 3 hours, he described his abuse in enough detail to prosecute the perpetrator. The dog hadn't done anything special. It had simply been there, calm and present and non-threatening. "There are dozens of these cases," Chen said, her voice growing more passionate. "Maybe hundreds, therapy dogs in trauma centers, service animals helping military veterans with PTSD, police dogs comforting witnesses at crime scenes. There's actual neurochemistry involved. When a person, especially a child, interacts with a calm animal, their cortisol levels drop, adrenaline decreases, oxytocin increases. That's the bonding hormone. The body's threat detection system literally shuts down. It's not magic, it's neuroscience." Morrison was listening now, genuinely listening, but he still looked skeptical. "You're describing therapy scenarios," he said carefully. "Controlled environments where the animal is specifically trained for therapeutic work. You want to bring an animal into a courtroom. That's completely different. It's unprecedented. The defense will argue it's prejudicial. They'll say we're manipulating a traumatized child. Judge Rollins will never approve it." Chen smiled, pulling out one more document. This one was different. It was a research proposal from the University of Portland, written by Dr. Margaret Steinberg, a leading expert in trauma-informed care and animal-assisted interventions. Chen had reached out to her after hours, desperate, explaining the situation. Dr. Steinberg had responded within 20 minutes and had written a comprehensive brief explaining not just the science behind animal-assisted therapy, but specifically how it could be ethically and legally applied to a courtroom situation with proper safeguards. "I talked to Dr. Steinberg," Chen said. "She's written us a brief that lays out the entire neurological basis for this intervention. She's also documented 17 separate cases where trained animals have been present during legal proceedings, custody evaluations, competency hearings, criminal trials. There's precedent. Not much, but it exists. And more importantly, James, she explains how we do this ethically and safely, with the child's best interests as the primary consideration." Morrison took the brief, scanning it quickly, his eyes moving faster as something in the research began to resonate with him. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let's say I'm even slightly interested in this insane idea. What dog are we talking about? It would have to be specially trained. It would have to be calm under pressure. It would need to understand courtroom environments." Chen's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's the thing," she said. We don't need to find a special dog, we already have one. Duke. The mention of Duke's name seemed to shift something in Morrison's understanding. Duke was legendary in Pacific Northwest law enforcement circles. A 5-year-old German shepherd with over 200 successful missing persons recoveries. Duke had been featured in news stories, had been commended by the governor, had saved more lives than most officers saved in their entire careers. But what made Duke truly exceptional wasn't his track record. It was his temperament, his uncanny ability to sense human distress and respond with an almost supernatural gentleness. Duke has been trained specifically for victim response, Chen explained. Not to intimidate, not to threaten, to comfort, to be present. His handler, Officer Marcus Webb, has spent 5 years teaching him that his job is to help people in pain, to sit with them, to offer presence. There isn't a more qualified dog in this state. There probably isn't one anywhere. And more than that, Duke has experience in courtrooms. He's been cross-examined as evidence in trials. He's walked through courtroom doors before. He understands the environment. Morrison set down the research papers and looked directly at Chen. If I propose this to Judge Rowlands, what are the chances she approves it? Chen took a breath. Honestly, probably low. Precedent is against us. Protocol is against us. It's unconventional and weird, and the defense will argue it's manipulative. But James, she leaned forward again, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, look at that case file. Look at what we have without Emma's testimony. Circumstantial evidence. A confident defense attorney. A defendant who will probably walk free. And a little girl who'll spend the rest of her life locked in silence, never getting justice, never healing. Is that better? Is that the safer choice? Morrison was quiet for a long time. He thought about Emma's hollow eyes. He thought about Catherine, sitting in the courtroom day after day, watching her daughter disappear deeper into trauma. He thought about David Mercer, smug and confident, about to win because they were following all the rules, taking all the conventional approaches, refusing to think outside the box. Okay, he said finally, his voice steady with decision. Write up a formal motion. Get me everything from Dr. Steinberg. Document every case where animal presence has helped trauma victims communicate. And get me more information about Duke, his training, his experience, his temperament. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. We're going to present such an airtight case to Judge Rowlands that she can't refuse on legal or scientific grounds. Chen stood up, her face radiant with hope for the first time in weeks. We're really doing this, she said softly. We're really doing this, Morrison confirmed. We're bringing a dog to break through trauma that science says can't be broken through with words. We're betting everything on something completely unconventional. He looked back at the case file, at Emma's small face in the photographs, at the image of Catherine's desperate hope fighting against the weight of despair. Get me everything, he said, because if we do this, it has to work. We only get one shot at this. Officer Marcus Webb stood in his modest apartment in southeast Portland with Duke lying across the living room floor, his massive frame stretched out in complete relaxation. Webb ran a soft brush through the dog's thick German Shepherd coat, working methodically from head to tail, removing loose fur and dirt accumulated from their morning patrol. Duke's eyes were half closed in contentment, occasionally lifting his head to make gentle eye contact with his handler, a ritual they'd performed thousands of times over 5 years. This wasn't just grooming. It was communication, meditation, the silent language that existed between a man and his dog. Webb had trained Duke since puppyhood with a philosophy that went fundamentally against traditional K-9 training doctrine. While other police departments built dogs designed to intimidate, to project dominance, to be weapons on a leash, Webb had built something entirely different. His approach was revolutionary, even controversial among some of his colleagues. He'd spent countless hours researching canine behavior, studying neuroscience, reading everything written by positive reinforcement trainers and animal behaviorists who understood that a dog could be both incredibly capable and profoundly gentle. The philosophy was simple in concept but revolutionary in execution: strength through gentleness, power through presence, authority through calm. Webb had started Duke's training when the dog was just 8 weeks old, a awkward puppy stumbling through the world on oversized paws. Instead of teaching Duke to bite, to chase, to dominate, Webb taught him something far more complex: how to read human emotion, how to sense pain and distress, how to respond to trauma with unconditional presence. Every training session had been carefully designed around the principle of gentle strength. When they worked on building Duke's physical capabilities, his speed, his agility, his power, Webb balanced it with equal emphasis on emotional intelligence. Duke learned to sit with a person in distress without jumping, without demanding attention, without pressing. He learned to lie beside someone experiencing anxiety and simply be there, his breathing becoming a rhythm for theirs to synchronize with. He learned that his presence was more powerful than any command, that sometimes the greatest strength was knowing when not to act. Over 5 years, Webb had watched his unconventional approach produce extraordinary results. Duke had participated in over 200 missing persons cases across the Pacific Northwest. But what made his record truly exceptional wasn't just the recovery rate. It was the manner in which he worked. In nearly every case, when victims were found, Duke's presence helped them process trauma, helped them speak to detectives, helped them begin healing at that critical moment right after discovery. Families reported that having Duke present at hospital visits helped their traumatized relatives relax, helped them feel safe enough to talk about what they'd experienced. Webb had documented 17 separate cases where victims had refused to speak to anyone: police officers, paramedics, family members, until Duke was brought to sit with them. Then, inexplicably, they'd begin talking, not because Duke had done anything special, not because he'd been trained in interrogation techniques, simply because his presence communicated safety, acceptance, non-judgment. The dog seemed to understand that his job wasn't to demand information, but to offer sanctuary. The department had recognized Duke's exceptional performance. He'd been featured in news articles, had been commended by the mayor, had been given awards and recognition. But Webb knew that none of that mattered. What mattered was the work. What mattered was the lives changed, the families reunited, the healing facilitated. Webb didn't care about accolades. He cared about watching a traumatized person's shoulders drop as they finally released tension they'd been carrying. He cared about seeing someone's eyes focus again, their breathing normalize, their wall of fear gradually dissolve. When Detective Chen called at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, Webb was in his apartment, reading a book about canine psychology. The detective's voice was urgent but controlled as she explained the situation. A 3-year-old girl who'd witnessed horrific trauma, complete selective mutism, prosecution collapsing without her testimony. They wanted to try something unprecedented, bringing Duke into the courtroom, not as evidence, but as a therapeutic presence to help the child's traumatized brain feel safe enough to communicate. Webb's first instinct was to say no. Courts were formal, controlled, high-stress environments. Bringing Duke into that space meant exposing his partner to unknown variables, to people who might react unpredictably, to a situation completely outside their normal operational parameters. But as Chen explained the science, as she described Emma's situation, as she painted a picture of a traumatized child locked in silence while justice hung in the balance, something shifted in Webb's understanding. This was exactly what Duke had been trained for, not the courtroom aspect. That was new, that was unprecedented. But the core mission had always been the same: help traumatized people feel safe enough to heal. The venue didn't matter. The formality of the setting didn't change what his dog was fundamentally capable of offering. "I'll talk to my captain," Webb said quietly. "I'll talk to Duke's veterinarian. I'll prepare him for the environment, but yes, we'll do it." After the call ended, Webb looked at Duke, who'd lifted his head at the sound of his name being spoken into the phone. The dog's dark eyes watched his handler with that profound intelligence that Webb had come to recognize as Duke's signature, an awareness that transcended normal animal consciousness. "We might save someone tomorrow, buddy," Webb whispered, kneeling down beside the dog and resting his forehead against Duke's. "A little girl who's lost, just like all the others we've found. But this time the person we're looking for is still here. She's just hidden inside herself. She's locked the doors so tight that nobody can reach her. But maybe you can. Maybe your presence will tell her that it's safe to come back out." Webb spent the rest of the evening preparing. He called Duke's veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison who'd worked with the dog since puppyhood. She confirmed that Duke was in perfect health, that there were no medical reasons he couldn't spend time in a courtroom environment. She also provided insights into managing the dog's stress during such an unusual situation, keeping his routine consistent, providing familiar items that carried his handler's scent, maintaining the exact same schedule that had worked for 5 years. Webb next contacted the department's training division and requested access to the building's empty courtroom, a space used for training officers in courtroom procedures. He spent Wednesday morning walking Duke through the space, familiarizing the dog with the wooden benches, the raised judge's platform, the echo of footsteps on the floor. Duke moved through the space with his characteristic calm, his sensitive nose working overtime as he processed the new environment. By the end of the walkthrough, the dog seemed comfortable, relaxed, ready. That evening, Webb laid out Duke's dress vest, a specially commissioned piece that identified him as an official police K-9. He brushed the dog's coat until every hair gleamed. He polished his own uniform until every button caught the light like a mirror. As he prepared his equipment, Webb thought about the weight of what they were attempting. This wasn't just another case. This was someone taking a chance on something unconventional, on something that broke every protocol, on an approach that could be criticized as manipulative or unethical if it went wrong. But if it worked, if Duke's presence could reach a traumatized child where all of modern psychology had failed, if a 3-year-old girl could find her voice again by simply sitting next to a calm dog, that would change everything. That would prove that sometimes justice, healing, and recovery didn't come from textbooks or traditional methods. Sometimes they came from the quiet, unconditional presence of an animal who understood something about trauma that no human could fully explain. Webb looked at Duke, sleeping peacefully on his bed, and felt the weight of purpose settle across his shoulders. Tomorrow, they were going to attempt the impossible. Tomorrow, they were going to walk into a courtroom and try to break through trauma using the only tool that mattered: presence, gentleness, and the inexplicable power of connection between a traumatized child and a dog who'd spent his entire life learning how to help people heal. Judge Patricia Rowland sat alone in her chambers, the oak-paneled room lit only by the desk lamp that cast long shadows across the mountain of legal documents spread before her. It was nearly midnight, and she'd been reading for 6 hours straight, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a cooling cup of coffee forgotten on the corner of her desk. Before her lay case law, psychological research papers, constitutional precedents, and ethical guidelines, all of it swirling together into a decision that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. 30 years on the bench. 30 years of making difficult decisions, of balancing justice against procedure, of interpreting the law while maintaining the integrity of the legal system. In 3 decades, Patricia Rowland had never faced a request quite like this one. Bring a dog into her courtroom. Allow an animal to influence testimony in a criminal case. Permit something so unconventional, so outside the realm of traditional jurisprudence, that it bordered on absurd. Yet here she was, unable to dismiss the request, unable to simply say no and move forward with conventional procedures. The prosecution's motion had been thorough, meticulously researched, and surprisingly compelling. James Morrison had submitted over 40 pages of supporting documentation, research papers from leading universities, case studies from other jurisdictions where animal-assisted interventions had succeeded in legal proceedings, psychological evaluations of Emma conducted by 3 separate experts, all confirming that traditional therapeutic approaches had failed completely. A comprehensive brief from Dr. Margaret Steinberg, a leading trauma researcher, explaining the neuroscience behind why a calm animal could potentially unlock a child's selective mutism when every other approach had failed. Judge Rowlands had read every page, twice. She'd pulled additional case law from her personal library, searching for any legal precedent that might guide her decision. What she found was sparse. There were a few cases where therapy animals had been present during custody evaluations. One case in California where a dog had been brought to a victim advocacy center during testimony. But nothing directly addressing the specific situation she faced. A criminal trial, a traumatized 3-year-old, the explicit goal of using an animal's presence to facilitate testimony. The defense had submitted their response, as expected. Patricia Hammond's brief was sharp and professionally argued. She contended that allowing an animal into the courtroom constituted prejudicial conduct, that it amounted to emotional manipulation of a witness, that it violated the defendant's right to a fair trial. She cited cases about courtroom decorum, about the necessity of formal procedure, about the dangers of allowing extrajudicial influences to affect witness testimony. It was a solid argument, the kind that would hold up in appellate court if Judge Rowlands made the wrong call. But then Patricia Hammond had made a tactical error. In her concluding paragraphs, she'd written, "While the court certainly sympathizes with the plight of the child victim in this case, sympathy cannot override procedure. The defendant's right to a fair trial must take precedence over the emotional comfort of a witness, regardless of that witness's age or trauma history." That sentence had struck Judge Rowlands like a physical blow. Sympathy cannot override procedure. And yet, wasn't the entire foundation of jurisprudence built on the principle that procedure exists to serve justice? Procedure was meant to be a tool for reaching justice, not an end in itself. When procedure became so rigid that it prevented justice from being served, didn't that procedure lose its legitimacy? Judge Rowlands thought about Emma. She'd seen the child in her courtroom multiple times, a small, hollow-eyed girl who seemed to exist in a dimension parallel to reality, present but utterly disconnected. The judge had worked in the criminal justice system long enough to understand trauma, to recognize the signs of a mind that had completely shut down as a survival mechanism. She understood the neuroscience, even without being an expert. When the human brain encounters trauma too severe to process, it builds walls. Those walls are protective. Breaking those walls through force, through aggressive questioning, through pressure, through demanding testimony, wouldn't help the child. It would damage her further. But what if there was another way? What if, as the research suggested, a calm animal could communicate safety to a traumatized child's nervous system in a way that no amount of verbal reassurance could? What if Duke's mere presence could lower cortisol levels, reduce adrenaline, increase oxytocin? What if the dog could do in minutes what 3 psychologists couldn't do in months? Judge Rowlands pulled out Dr. Steinberg's brief again and read a passage she'd highlighted. The presence of a calm, trained animal can create a neurobiological shift in a traumatized person's state of being. The animal's steady breathing, consistent heartbeat, non-threatening demeanor, and unconditional acceptance communicate safety at a level deeper than words can reach. For a child who has constructed psychological walls so thick that verbal therapy cannot penetrate, an animal's presence offers a bypass around those defenses, not through manipulation, but through the activation of neural pathways associated with bonding, safety, and trust. That was the key word, not manipulation, healing, connection, trust. Yes, Duke's presence would influence Emma's emotional state, but wasn't that the entire purpose of having victims present in courtrooms, to tell the truth through their authentic emotional experience? Wasn't the jury supposed to assess a witness's credibility based partly on their demeanor, their emotional authenticity, their clarity of presence? Judge Rowlands stood up and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out at the Portland night. The city lights twinkled below, thousands of people sleeping peacefully, unaware of the legal and ethical complexities being worked through in the courthouse. She thought about her own grandson, who was 4 years old. She thought about what it would be like if he'd experienced what Emma had experienced. She thought about whether she would want the justice system to pursue justice for him with everything at its disposal, or whether she would want procedure to prevent that pursuit because an animal was involved. The answer became clear. Judge Rowlands returned to her desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. She began writing her decision by hand, the way she always did for important rulings. She wrote about the law, about procedure, about the rights of the accused. But she also wrote about justice, about the purpose of procedure, about the responsibility of the court system to adapt when faced with unprecedented circumstances. She wrote about Emma, about the trauma she'd endured, about the reality that conventional approaches had completely failed. She wrote, "While this court recognizes that allowing an animal into a courtroom represents a significant departure from established procedure, the court also recognizes that procedure exists as a means to justice, not as an end in itself. When conventional procedures have demonstrably failed to serve justice, the court has both the authority and the responsibility to explore alternative approaches that are ethically grounded and scientifically sound." Judge Rowlands continued writing through the night, building her argument carefully, layer by layer, creating a legal foundation that could withstand appellate scrutiny. She acknowledged the defense's concerns about fairness while explaining why allowing the animal's presence didn't violate those principles. She cited the research. She referenced the case studies. She quoted constitutional scholars about the purpose of legal procedure. By 5 a.m., her decision was complete. 15 pages of careful legal reasoning that concluded with a single directive. Officer Marcus Webb and the police dog Duke would be permitted to appear in court during Emma's testimony, subject to strict protocols designed to ensure the animal's presence was therapeutic rather than prejudicial. Judge Rowlands set down her pen and removed her reading glasses, rubbing her tired eyes. She knew this decision would be controversial. She knew there would be appeals, criticism from legal scholars who believed she'd overstepped. But she also knew that 30 years of experience had taught her something fundamental. Justice sometimes required courage. Justice sometimes required breaking from tradition. Justice sometimes required recognizing that the rules existed to serve humanity, not the other way around. She picked up her phone and called her chamber's secretary at home, asking her to schedule a meeting with both prosecution and defense for that afternoon. Then she sat back in her chair, her decision made, her conviction firm, and waited for dawn to break over Portland so she could set events in motion that would change everything for a small girl locked in silence. Outside her chambers, the city slept. Inside, Judge Patricia Rowlands had just made a decision that would ripple far beyond this single courtroom, far beyond this single case. She just ruled that sometimes justice required an unconventional tool. Sometimes justice required stepping outside the lines. Sometimes justice required the presence of something as simple and profound as a dog. Wednesday arrived gray and cold, the kind of Portland morning that felt like the city itself was holding its breath. A persistent drizzle fell from clouds so low they seemed to touch the rooftops of downtown buildings. Officer Marcus Webb stood outside the courthouse at 8:47 a.m., Duke beside him, both of them waiting for the moment that would either change everything or become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unconventional thinking in the legal system. Webb wore his dress uniform pressed to perfection, every button polished to a mirror shine, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. His boots gleamed despite the wet pavement. His badge caught the gray morning light and threw it back like a small star. But it was Duke who commanded attention. The German Shepherd wore his official police K9 vest, freshly cleaned, his credentials displayed prominently. The dog's black and tan coat had been groomed until every individual hair seemed to catch the light. Duke's posture was perfect, alert but calm, his ears at attention, his dark eyes focused and intelligent. Webb's hand trembled slightly as he held Duke's leash. He'd worked hundreds of cases, had walked into situations of extreme danger without flinching, had faced criminals and crimes that would haunt most people's nightmares. But this moment terrified him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't about danger. This was about hope. This was about the possibility that his partner, the animal he'd trained, raised, and trusted more than almost anyone, might help a traumatized child find her voice. The stakes felt impossibly high. Webb checked his watch. 8:52 a.m. 8 minutes until they were scheduled to enter the courtroom. 8 minutes until the prosecution would have to present this unconventional approach to a jury that had already made up their minds about the case based on conventional evidence. 8 minutes until they would either validate Judge Rowland's unprecedented decision or prove her critics right. Webb thought about the phone call he'd received from Detective Chen the night before. The judge had made her ruling. The motion had been approved. They were cleared to proceed. But with that approval came an avalanche of doubt. Defense attorneys were already filing emergency appeals, arguing that Judge Rowlands had overstepped her authority. News outlets had picked up the story. Judge ALLOW's dog in criminal trial. The headline screamed, accompanied by sensationalized language that made the whole situation sound like a circus rather than a carefully considered legal decision. Webb had spent the night barely sleeping, running through scenarios in his mind. What if Duke became stressed in the courtroom environment? What if the dog reacted unpredictably? What if his presence actually made things worse instead of better? What if Emma took one look at Duke and became even more traumatized? The what-ifs multiplied in the darkness, each one carrying the weight of consequence. But when Webb looked at Duke, the dog's calm presence seemed to settle his own anxieties. Duke had spent 5 years being trained for exactly this, to sense when someone needed help, to offer presence without judgment, to communicate safety through his very existence. The dog didn't understand courtrooms or legal procedures or the enormous pressure hanging over this moment. Duke only understood that his handler needed him, and that was enough. At 8:59 a.m., Detective Chen appeared at the courthouse entrance, her face a mixture of determination and nervousness. Behind her came James Morrison, the prosecutor, his jaw set tight, his eyes carrying the weight of a case that had consumed his professional life for months. Morrison looked like a man who'd made a decision he believed in but wasn't entirely certain about, a man betting everything on something unconventional, and hoping the gamble would pay off. "It's time," Chen said simply. Webb nodded and began walking toward the courthouse entrance, Duke moving flawlessly beside him. They'd rehearsed this walk a dozen times, through the building, down the hallway, toward the courtroom doors. Webb had made sure Duke was completely comfortable with the route, completely accustomed to the sounds and smells of the building. But this time was different. This time was real. The walk through the courthouse felt both eternal and instantaneous. Webb's military background kicked in, his mind narrowing focus to the moment at hand, pushing away fear and doubt and replacing them with clarity of purpose. His breathing steadied. His grip on Duke's leash became firm but not tight. His posture straightened. When they approached the courtroom doors, Webb looked down at Duke one final time, making eye contact with his partner, that wordless communication that had been refined over 5 years. "You've got this, buddy," Webb whispered. "Just be you." Then they pushed through the doors into the courtroom. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Every head in the gallery turned. Whispers died mid-sentence. Even the court personnel who'd known this was coming seemed unprepared for the physical reality of it. A uniformed police officer and a massive German shepherd walking into a formal courtroom during an active trial. It violated something fundamental about how people expected courtrooms to function. Webb walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured and controlled. Duke moved beside him with perfect heel positioning, the product of thousands of hours of training. They walked past the gallery where reporters sat, notebooks already in hand. They walked past the defense table where David Mercer sat, his confident expression faltering for just a moment as he registered the dog's presence. He seemed suddenly unsure. as if Duke's presence introduced something he hadn't prepared for, something his expensive attorney hadn't coached him on how to handle. And then Webb saw Emma. The 3-year-old sat rigidly on the wooden bench in the gallery, her small frame dwarfed by the seat. Her mother, Catherine, sat beside her, her hand gripping the bench so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Emma's eyes, those hollow, distant eyes that had stared at nothing for 6 months, suddenly focused. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing changed. Something shifted in her entire being. Webb's heart nearly stopped. He saw the exact moment recognition occurred in the child's face. Not recognition of Duke specifically, they'd never met before, but recognition of something her traumatized nervous system understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. Recognition of safety. Recognition of non-threat. Recognition of presence without judgment. Duke's nose twitched, catching Emma's scent, her fear, her desperation, her longing. The dog's ears perked forward. His entire focus narrowed to a single point in space, a small girl who was lost inside herself, locked away behind walls she'd constructed to survive. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the judge, who'd made the unprecedented ruling, seemed to lean forward slightly, watching to see if her decision would vindicate itself or backfire spectacularly. The jury sat motionless. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike seemed to hold their breath. Webb continued walking, not toward Emma, but to his designated position near the front of the courtroom, respecting the child's space, understanding that forcing contact would violate everything Duke had been trained for. He positioned himself and Duke several feet away from where Emma sat, creating distance that respected her autonomy while allowing the dog's presence to be felt. The moment hung suspended in time. Everything depended on what happened in the next few seconds. Everything: justice, healing, Emma's future, the precedent this case would set for courtrooms across the country, depended on whether a traumatized 3-year-old would reach out to a dog, or whether she would retreat further into the silence that had consumed her. Webb watched Emma's small hands grip the edge of the bench. He watched her shoulders begin to relax incrementally, as if her nervous system was receiving signals from Duke's steady presence. He watched her breathing slow, synchronizing with the dog's calm, measured respirations. He watched the first tear slip down her cheek, not from fear but from something else entirely: recognition, hope, connection. The moment everything changed was about to arrive, and it would come not through words, not through procedure, not through conventional legal process. It would come through the inexplicable power of presence, through the quiet connection between a traumatized child and a dog who'd spent his entire life learning how to help people heal. Officer Marcus Webb made a deliberate decision to stop his forward movement 3 feet from where Emma sat. Not closer, not farther. Exactly 3 feet, the distance he and Duke had practiced in training scenarios, the space that allowed presence without intrusion, proximity without pressure. Webb understood something fundamental about trauma that many people missed. Forcing connection onto a traumatized person was itself a form of violation. Emma had to choose. Emma had to decide whether Duke was safe. Emma had to come to the dog in her own time, at her own pace, or the entire intervention would backfire spectacularly. So Webb simply stood there, completely still, his hand holding Duke's leash but not pulling, not directing, not demanding anything from his partner. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment with an intelligence that transcended normal animal consciousness. Duke didn't jump. Duke didn't strain forward. Duke didn't perform any of the behaviors that might frighten a traumatized child. Instead, the dog slowly lowered his head, his ears still perked forward, his dark brown eyes locked entirely on Emma's face. What happened next was subtle but profound. Duke's breathing deliberately slowed, becoming deeper and more measured. The dog's entire body relaxed, his massive frame settling into a posture of complete non-threat. Webb watched his partner enter a state of focused calm that he'd only seen Duke achieve in the most critical situations, when he was working with severely traumatized victims, when he was communicating that it was safe to let down your guard, when he was offering the neurobiological reassurance that his presence provided. Emma's breath, which had been rapid and shallow for 6 months, began to slow. Webb could see it happening, her small ribcage rising and falling at a slightly less frantic pace. Her thumb, which had been perpetually hooked into her mouth since the trauma, slipped out. Her fingers, which had been gripping the bench edge with white-knuckled intensity, began to gradually relax. It was as if Duke's calm was transmitting through the air itself, reaching into Emma's nervous system and communicating something that words never could. Catherine, Emma's mother, sat completely frozen beside her daughter. Tears streamed silently down her face as she watched her child respond to Duke's presence in ways she hadn't responded to anyone in 6 months. Catherine had spent hundreds of hours sitting beside Emma, talking to her, singing to her, trying every possible way to reach the daughter who disappeared behind walls of trauma. Nothing had worked. But this silent presence of a dog standing perfectly still, communicating nothing but acceptance, seemed to be breaking through barriers that nothing else could penetrate. The courtroom remained in absolute silence. Judge Rollins leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable but her eyes intense, watching to see if her unprecedented decision would be validated or proven catastrophically wrong. The jury sat motionless, many of them seeming to forget they were witnessing a legal proceeding and simply bearing witness to something deeply human. Even David Mercer, the defendant, seemed momentarily unsettled by what was unfolding before him, something he couldn't control, something outside his understanding, something that introduced an element of unpredictability into a case he'd felt confident about. Webb noticed something shift in Emma's face. The hollow distance that had characterized her expression for months began to soften almost imperceptibly. It was like watching ice begin to melt under the warmth of sun. The child's eyes, which had been focused on some distant point beyond reality, suddenly came into sharp focus. She was looking at Duke, really looking at him, not through him, not past him, directly at him. Duke held completely still, his breathing providing the rhythm of calm, his presence offering the safety that Emma's traumatized nervous system desperately needed. The dog's training had prepared him for this, for the moment when a traumatized person needed to make contact at their own pace, when any pressure from the dog would violate the delicate process of trust formation. Duke had been taught that sometimes the greatest strength was perfect stillness. Seconds turned into what felt like minutes. Emma's small shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in a permanent posture of protection, began to drop slightly. The tension that had gripped her entire body for 6 months seemed to ease, just fractionally, but noticeably. Her breathing synchronized with Duke's breathing, a neurobiological phenomenon that happened when two nervous systems found harmony with each other. Then something extraordinary occurred. Emma made a sound, not words, not even a complete vocalization, just a small, almost questioning sound, something between a sigh and a whisper. It was the first voluntary sound she'd made in 6 months, and the entire courtroom seemed to recognize its significance. Several jurors' eyes widened. The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly, as if offering a silent prayer of gratitude. Catherine's hand moved to her mouth, stifling a sob. But Emma wasn't done. The small sound seemed to have opened something inside her, like a valve had been turned, like a door had been cracked open just slightly. She shifted her position on the bench, her body turning slightly toward Duke, her small hands releasing their death grip on the wooden seat and moving tentatively toward her lap. Every movement was small, incremental, but they represented a massive shift from the frozen, statue-like state she'd inhabited for months. Webb watched Duke's response with the keen eye of someone who'd studied this dog's behavior for 5 years. The dog didn't move forward, didn't push, didn't take advantage of Emma's movement toward him. Instead, Duke did something more profound. Duke lowered his massive head further, bringing his face down to Emma's level, making himself smaller, less imposing, more vulnerable. It was a gesture of pure deference, a communication in dog language that said, "You are safe with me. Your fear doesn't threaten me. I will move at your pace." Emma's entire body trembled slightly. Whether it was from cold, fear, or overwhelming emotion, it was impossible to tell. But the trembling seemed to be the physical manifestation of her nervous system beginning to release 6 months of held tension. Her eyes, locked on Duke's eyes, began to glisten with tears. Not tears of fear. These were tears of something else, grief, perhaps, or relief, or the beginning of healing that comes when a traumatized person finally feels safe enough to feel. Catherine reached over and placed a gentle hand on Emma's back, not pulling, not pushing, just offering maternal presence to her daughter. And Emma didn't pull away. That was significant. For 6 months, Emma had barely tolerated physical contact. But now, with Duke's presence anchoring her, with the dog's calm communicating safety at a neurobiological level, Emma allowed her mother's touch. She allowed connection. She allowed the beginning of healing. Webb felt moisture in his own eyes. He'd worked hundreds of cases with Duke. He'd seen his partner facilitate countless rescues, help countless victims. But this moment felt different. This moment felt like watching a child come back from the edge of the abyss. This moment felt like witnessing the exact instant when trauma begins to release its grip on a human soul. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emma's mother held her daughter. Duke held perfectly still, communicating safety through his very being. Officer Webb held Duke's leash, holding the space, holding the moment, allowing something profound and healing to unfold before the entire legal system. And then Emma made another sound. This one was slightly louder, slightly more intentional. It carried a different quality, less questioning, more exploratory. It was as if the child was testing her voice, testing whether it was safe to make sounds, testing whether the world would respond to her attempts at communication with anything other than pressure and demand. The moment was shifting. The connection was deepening. And everyone in that courtroom understood that they were witnessing something they would never forget. The exact instant when a traumatized child began her journey back toward wholeness, guided by the unconditional presence of a dog who'd been trained to offer exactly what she needed most. "Good dog." Emma's voice emerged like a whisper carried on wind, so faint that several people in the courtroom almost missed it. The words were barely audible, fragmented, uncertain. The voice of a child who hadn't used her vocal cords for 6 months, whose throat had forgotten how to produce language, whose mind had locked away the ability to speak as a survival mechanism. But those 2 words, simple, ordinary, profoundly extraordinary in their context, seemed to crack open the entire architecture of silence that had surrounded Emma since the day of her mother's kidnapping. The court reporter leaned forward. "Could you repeat that, please? Speak up if you can." "Good dog," Emma whispered again, slightly louder this time, her small voice carrying the weight of 1,000 conversations. The words hung in the courtroom air like something sacred, something that should be preserved in amber, something that represented the culmination of science and hope, and the unconventional belief that sometimes healing comes not from textbooks, but from the quiet presence of an animal who understands trauma without needing to understand language. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Catherine, Emma's mother, made a sound, a combination of a gasp and a sob and a prayer of thanksgiving, that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. Her hand, which had been resting gently on Emma's back, began to tremble. Tears poured down her face, years of worry and fear and desperate hope finally finding release in the moment her daughter spoke. Several jurors visibly reacted. One woman covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. A man in the back row wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Even the judge, who maintained her composure professionally, seemed to lean back in her chair with an expression of profound relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. The prosecutor closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were glistening. But the most extraordinary thing happened next. As if speaking those 2 words had unlocked something fundamental in Emma's consciousness, as if the simple act of using her voice had shattered the psychological barriers that had contained her, the floodgates opened. Not all at once, not in a torrent of overwhelming speech, but in a gradual, accelerating flow of words that grew louder, clearer, more coherent with each sentence. Emma began to describe the basement. Her small voice, gaining strength with each word, painted a picture so vivid, so detailed, so specific that everyone in the courtroom understood immediately that only someone who had been there could possibly know these things. She described the blue walls, the exact shade of blue, pale and institutional. She described the water stain in the corner that looked like a sleeping dog. She described the broken refrigerator light that made a humming sound that hurt her ears. Webb watched Duke remain absolutely motionless throughout Emma's testimony, the dog's presence serving as an anchor, a grounding force that kept Emma connected to the present moment even as she accessed memories of past trauma. The dog's steady breathing continued, creating a rhythm that Emma seemed to synchronize with. When Emma's voice wavered, when she seemed to be approaching the edges of memories too painful to fully articulate, Duke would shift his weight almost imperceptibly, and Emma would stabilize, would find her center again, would continue. The kitchen had a broken light, Emma said, her small voice becoming clearer, more confident. And there was a red truck outside. I could see it from the little window up high. Red truck, big red truck. Catherine squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently, offering wordless support, allowing Emma to continue at her own pace. The social worker who'd been assigned to Emma sat nearby, taking notes, documenting the child's testimony, ensuring that every word would be recorded and preserved. And he was there, Emma continued, her voice dropping slightly as she approached the most difficult parts of her memory. She pointed toward David Mercer, her small finger extending with an accusatory clarity that no amount of legal argument could refute. That man, he was there. He hurt Mommy. I heard her crying. I heard her scream. The defense attorney, Patricia Hammond, started to stand, but Judge Rollins raised her hand in a gesture that silenced any objection. This was testimony from a 3-year-old child, obtained through unconventional means perhaps, but testimony nonetheless. Testimony that had been elicited without leading questions, without pressure, without anything other than the presence of a calm animal that had created the psychological safety necessary for the child to speak. Emma continued describing details. The smell of the basement, damp and moldy, the sound of the door locking and unlocking, the man's voice, mean voice, loud voice, scary voice. She described hiding in the corner, trying to make herself small, trying to be invisible. She described her mother's attempts to comfort her even while being tortured. She described the moment the police broke down the door and the flood of light that seemed to save them both. As Emma spoke, Duke maintained his perfect stillness, but Webb noticed subtle shifts in the dog's behavior. When Emma's voice grew shaky, Duke's breathing deepened slightly, as if the dog was intentionally providing a stronger rhythm for her to synchronize with. When Emma approached particularly traumatic memories, Duke would lower his head even further, his presence becoming more grounding, more present, more protective. It was as if the dog was actively facilitating the testimony, not through any trained command, but through an intuitive understanding of what this traumatized child needed in order to speak her truth. The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word. Prosecutors took careful notes, knowing that this testimony, despite its unconventional facilitation, would be crucial to securing a conviction. The jury watched Emma with an intensity that transcended legal procedure. They were watching a child heal in real time, watching trauma begin to transform into testimony, watching silence become speech. He tied Mommy's hands, Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she moved toward describing concrete facts rather than emotional experiences. I saw the rope, white rope. He said bad words. He said he would hurt Mommy bad, he said. Emma paused, and Duke shifted his weight, providing support, and Emma continued. He said he would hurt me too if Mommy didn't listen. Catherine's body shook with silent sobs beside her daughter, but she remained present, remained steady, remained the anchor that Emma needed on the other side of this traumatic testimony. But Mommy didn't let him, Emma said, and something shifted in her voice, a note of pride, of recognition of her mother's courage. Mommy was brave. Mommy protected me. And then the police came and the man went away. The description of Mercer's face, his voice, his actions, his specific words and threats, all of it poured out of Emma in a torrent of testimony that prosecutors could never have obtained through conventional questioning. The child was speaking not because she'd been pressured or manipulated, but because she'd been made to feel safe. She was speaking because a dog's presence had communicated at a neurobiological level that it was finally safe to speak. Over the next 20 minutes, Emma described the apartment location, the street, the building number, the position of the basement room. She described the window where the red truck was visible. She described the kitchen appliances, the bathroom fixtures, the specific layout of the space. She described sounds and smells and visual details with the clarity of someone who had been there, who had experienced it directly, who could not possibly be confused or mistaken. Every word was gold for the prosecution. Every detail was a nail in the coffin of David Mercer's defense. Every statement was corroborated by the physical evidence officers had collected at the scene, evidence that meant nothing without testimony to give it context, but which now, in light of Emma's detailed description, became devastatingly significant. And throughout it all, Duke remained still. The dog's presence had unlocked something that no amount of therapy or pressure or conventional questioning could have accessed. The dog had offered what the entire legal system, with all its procedures and protocols and expertise, could not. Unconditional safety, non-judgmental presence, the neurobiological reassurance that it was finally safe to come back into the world. 2 words had shattered the silence, but it was the presence of a dog that had made those words possible. 3 weeks later, the jury deliberated for exactly 87 minutes before returning with their verdict. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, victims' advocates, psychology students who'd followed the case, law students studying the unprecedented legal precedent. When the jury foreman stood and announced guilty on all counts, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The prosecution team exhaled in collective relief. Emma's mother wept openly, years of terror and uncertainty finally giving way to something approaching closure. Even Judge Rowlands, who maintained her professional composure, allowed herself the smallest nod of acknowledgement. David Mercer's face went white. His expensive attorney, Patricia Hammond, began whispering furiously, already planning appeals, already constructing arguments about the dog's prejudicial presence, already preparing legal briefs that would challenge the unprecedented decision to allow an animal in the courtroom. But everyone understood the reality. The jury had heard Emma's testimony, had seen the details she provided, had recognized that only someone who'd been there could possibly know those things. The dog hadn't created false testimony. The dog had simply created the safety necessary for true testimony to emerge. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. Judge Rowlands handed down 25 years without possibility of parole. As she read the sentence, she made a point to acknowledge the unusual circumstances of the case. "This court recognizes," she said from the bench, "that justice sometimes requires us to step outside conventional boundaries when those boundaries prevent justice from being served." The presence of Officer Webb's K-9 partner Duke facilitated testimony that was crucial to establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This case will serve as a reminder that sometimes healing and justice require unconventional approaches grounded in science and compassion. The ruling would become famous in legal circles. Law schools would teach it. Psychology departments would study it. Victim advocacy organizations would cite it as precedent for animal-assisted interventions in courtroom settings. But more importantly, in the months and years that followed, other jurisdictions began adopting similar approaches, carefully, cautiously, with appropriate safeguards, but recognizing that sometimes the most powerful tools for justice came not from legal procedure, but from understanding the neurobiology of trauma. The real victory, however, unfolded not in courtrooms or legal precedent, but in the quiet, private moments that followed. 6 months after the trial ended, Officer Marcus Webb received a handwritten letter at the police station. The envelope was addressed in careful block letters that suggested a child had helped write it. Inside was a letter written in a woman's handwriting, filled with gratitude and hope, and the kind of emotional honesty that comes from surviving something that should have destroyed you. "Dear Officer Webb," the letter began, "I don't know how to adequately thank you and Duke for what you did for Emma. 6 months ago, I thought my daughter was lost forever. I thought the trauma had taken her away from me, locked her inside herself in a place I could never reach. But you believed that something unconventional might work when everything conventional had failed. You trusted your dog to do something no human could do, and you changed our lives." Catherine described how Emma had gradually transformed in the months following the trial. The nightmares that had plagued her almost every night had become less frequent. She'd started laughing again, real, genuine laughter that came from deep in her belly. She'd begun playing with toys, engaging with other children, showing interest in the world around her. Most importantly, she'd begun talking, not just in response to questions, but spontaneously, freely, the way children are supposed to talk. "Last week," Catherine wrote, "Emma asked if she could see the good dog again. I didn't know if that would be possible, but I called Detective Chen, and she arranged a supervised visit in the park. I've enclosed a photograph." The photograph showed Emma, now 4 years old, her arm draped around Duke's neck in a sunny Portland park. Both of them were smiling, genuine, unguarded smiles that captured something essential about the bond that had formed between a traumatized child and a dog who'd spent his life learning how to help people heal. Emma's eyes, which had been hollow and distant during the trial, were bright and present and full of life. Duke's expression carried the quiet satisfaction of a being who'd been called upon to do what he was made for, and had delivered beyond expectation. Webb kept that letter in his locker at the police station. He read it on hard days, on days when the weight of cases overwhelmed him, on days when he questioned whether anything he did really mattered. The letter was proof that it did. The photograph was evidence that healing was possible, that unconventional approaches could work, that sometimes justice wasn't found in legal arguments or courtroom procedure, but in connection between a child and a dog. Over the following years, Duke's fame grew. The case became legendary in victim advocacy circles, in trauma psychology departments, in law enforcement training programs across the country. Police departments began requesting consultations about animal-assisted interventions. Universities incorporated the case into their curriculum. Other handlers began studying Duke's training methods, attempting to replicate his unique approach to victim response. But the most meaningful impact wasn't measured in legal precedent or academic citations. The most meaningful impact was measured in Emma's life. She started kindergarten the following fall, thriving academically and socially. She developed friendships. She participated in activities. She became a normal, healthy child, not unburdened by her trauma, not pretending it hadn't happened, but integrated it into her story in a way that allowed her to move forward. Catherine went back to work. She'd spent the 6 months following her rescue and recovery, physical therapy for the injuries Mercer had inflicted, psychological counseling for the trauma of captivity. But with Emma healing, with justice served, with the knowledge that the man who'd tortured her was locked away for decades, Catherine found the strength to rebuild her life. She started a support group for other victims of intimate partner violence, using her own experience to help others understand that recovery was possible, that healing took time, but that it was within reach. On the second anniversary of the trial, Emma and Catherine attended a community event where Officer Webb and Duke were being honored for their work. Emma, now 6 years old, ran up to Duke with complete unself-consciousness and hugged the dog around the neck. Duke, understanding the significance of the moment, stood perfectly still, allowing the girl to express her gratitude and affection. Cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions, but Webb barely noticed. His attention was entirely on the moment unfolding before him, A child who'd been locked in silence, now freely expressing joy, now able to touch and hug and love an animal who'd helped her find her voice. That night, Webb sat in his apartment with Duke, reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that gray Wednesday morning when they'd walked into a courtroom. He thought about Judge Rowland's courage in approving an unconventional approach. He thought about Detective Chen's persistence in believing that science could guide them towards something that seemed impossible. He thought about Dr. Steinberg's research that provided the foundation for understanding why a dog's presence could reach a traumatized child when human expertise couldn't. But most of all, he thought about Duke, about 5 years of training grounded in the philosophy that strength comes through gentleness, about learning to recognize that sometimes the most powerful thing a being can do is simply be present, without demanding, without forcing, without any agenda other than offering safety. About the understanding that healing doesn't come from words or procedures or expertise, but from connection. When Duke retired the following year, his body aging, his energy levels declining after years of intense work, the retirement ceremony was attended by hundreds of people. Emma attended, now 7 years old, a happy, healthy, articulate child who'd been given the gift of voice by a dog who'd understood something about trauma that transcended normal animal consciousness. Webb's greatest case wasn't a missing person he'd recovered. It wasn't a criminal he'd helped apprehend. His greatest case was a little girl who'd been lost inside herself, found not through words or procedure or conventional expertise, but through the quiet, unconditional presence of a dog who'd been trained to offer exactly what she needed most: safety, acceptance, and the neurobiological reassurance that it was finally safe to come back into the world. The case became a turning point in victim advocacy, proving that sometimes justice isn't found in laws or arguments or procedure. Sometimes justice is found in connection. Sometimes healing comes not from what we know, but from who we allow to help us. And sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not in words, but in the quiet presence of love. Duke retired to a comfortable home with Webb, spending his final years doing what he'd been trained for, simply being present for those who needed him. And Emma grew into a strong, resilient woman who would one day work in victim advocacy herself, remembering always the moment a dog helped her find her voice, remembering always that sometimes the most important witness is the one who offers unconditional presence without judgment. In courtrooms across the country, legal precedent was being established. But in the heart of a little girl and in the partnership between a man and his dog, something more profound had been proven: that sometimes the greatest justice comes not from following the rules, but from breaking them when those rules prevent healing. And that sometimes the most powerful tool for truth is the quiet, unconditional presence of an animal who understands that the greatest gift we can offer another being is simply to be there, to listen, to hold space for their healing, and to communicate, without words, that they are safe, they are seen, and they are loved.